April 15th, 1991. Mount Wilson Observatory, California. The night sky stretched endlessly above the San Gabriel Mountains, a canvas of stars that had witnessed countless astronomical discoveries. But on this particular night, something far more sinister than celestial phenomena would unfold within the observatory's walls. Christopher Hayes, a 34-year-old astronomer specializing in lunar reflection patterns, had been the last person scheduled to use the facility's main telescope. His shift was supposed to end at 2 a.m. By dawn, he had vanished without a trace. So glad to have you here. Comment your city so I can bring cases from your region and also know where you're watching me from. Amanda Hayes contacted the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department at 8:30 that morning. Her husband had not returned home, had not called, and was not answering his pager. This behavior was entirely out of character for Christopher, a methodical scientist who maintained strict routines and always communicated his whereabouts. Deputies arrived at the observatory within the hour. Christopher's silver sedan remained in the parking lot, keys still in the ignition, his briefcase visible on the passenger seat. The observatory itself showed no signs of forced entry or struggle. His workstation appeared undisturbed, with notebooks stacked neatly beside the computer terminal and his favorite coffee mug still half full, the liquid long since gone cold. What immediately caught investigators' attention were the astronomical logs from Christopher's final observation session. The entries became increasingly erratic as the night progressed. Standard measurements and coordinates gave way to hastily scribbled notes about unusual light patterns and reflection angles that seemed to defy conventional lunar behavior. One phrase appeared multiple times in the margins: "Impossible trajectory verified." Robert Chen, the observatory's director, was called in for questioning. He explained that Christopher had been working on a long-term project analyzing historical lunar data, comparing decades-old observations with current measurements. The work was considered routine, nothing that would typically generate controversy or concern within the scientific community. However, Nicole Stevens, Christopher's research assistant, provided a different perspective. During the weeks leading up to his disappearance, Christopher had become increasingly preoccupied with his research. He had requested access to archived materials from lunar missions conducted in the 1970s, some of which carried restricted classifications. Nicole recalled him mentioning that he had discovered something significant in the data, something that had practical applications beyond pure astronomy. Amanda confirmed her husband's unusual behavior at home. He had become withdrawn, spending hours reviewing documents in his home office late into the night. When she asked about his work, Christopher would deflect, insisting he needed to verify his findings before discussing them. He had received several phone calls in the evenings from individuals who refused to identify themselves, conversations that left him visibly agitated. The investigation took on greater urgency when deputies discovered a hidden compartment in Christopher's observatory desk. Inside was a leather-bound notebook filled with complex mathematical calculations, star charts marked with unusual annotations, and a list of names written in what appeared to be a simple substitution code. None of Christopher's colleagues recognized the coding system or understood the significance of the calculations. Search teams combed the mountainous terrain surrounding the observatory. The area was rugged and remote, with countless ravines and densely wooded sections where someone could easily become lost or injured. Bloodhounds picked up Christopher's scent, leading away from the main building toward a service road rarely used except for equipment deliveries. But the trail went cold at the pavement. Detectives began constructing a timeline of Christopher's final hours. Security logs showed he had entered the observatory at 9 p.m, his usual starting time for overnight observation sessions. A delivery driver reported seeing Christopher's car in the lot around midnight. But after that, no confirmed sightings existed. The investigation expanded to include interviews with everyone who had interacted with Christopher in the weeks before his disappearance. A pattern emerged. The astronomer had been asking pointed questions about vintage military communication systems, specifically those that utilized lunar reflection for signal transmission. This line of inquiry seemed oddly disconnected from his official research focus. Financial records revealed no irregularities. Christopher's bank accounts showed routine transactions, no large withdrawals or unusual purchases. His credit cards had not been used since the afternoon before he disappeared. There were no indications of marital problems, financial stress, or mental health concerns that might explain a voluntary disappearance. As the first week of investigation drew to a close, authorities faced a baffling case with few solid leads. An experienced astronomer had effectively vanished from a secure facility with no witnesses, no obvious motive, and no clear explanation. His vehicle remained behind, his research appeared unfinished, and his family desperately sought answers. The final entry in Christopher's official observation log, time-stamped at 1:47 in the morning, consisted of a single line: "Meeting confirmed, East Access Point, 2:15. Verification required." Investigators now faced an uncomfortable question. Had Christopher Hayes arranged to meet someone on the night he disappeared? And if so, what had transpired during that encounter that would cause a dedicated scientist to vanish without a trace, leaving behind only cryptic notes and unanswered questions? The answer to that question would remain hidden for 32 years, buried alongside secrets that some would kill to protect. The investigation into Christopher Hayes's disappearance intensified during the second week, as detectives delved deeper into the astronomer's professional activities. What they uncovered suggested that his work had intersected with matters far beyond academic research. Detective Sarah Miller from the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department specialized in missing persons cases. She approached Christopher's disappearance with methodical precision, examining every document, every record, every interaction that might provide insight into what had happened on that April night. The breakthrough came when investigators obtained permission to access Christopher's restricted research requests from various government agencies. Over the previous 6 months, he had submitted formal inquiries to the National Archives, the Department of Defense, and NASA's Historical Records Division. Each request focused on a specific topic: Project Moonbeam, a classified military communication program from the 1970s. Project Moonbeam had utilized lunar surface reflection to bounce encrypted radio signals across vast distances, effectively creating an untraceable communication network. The technology had been experimental and ultimately abandoned due to technical limitations and the emergence of satellite communications. Most documentation regarding the project remained classified decades after its cancellation. Christopher had been persistent in his attempts to access these records. His formal requests cited academic research purposes, claiming he needed the data to verify astronomical observations from that era. Several requests had been denied outright, while others received heavily redacted responses that provided minimal useful information. Nicole Stevens, when questioned further, revealed additional details about Christopher's state of mind in the weeks before his disappearance. He had become convinced that someone was monitoring his research. He noticed his office had been searched, with papers slightly out of place and files opened that he distinctly remembered closing. His home computer had shown signs of unauthorized access, with login attempts recorded during hours when neither he nor Amanda were present. The coded names in Christopher's hidden notebook became a priority for investigators. Cryptography experts from the FBI were consulted, and within days they had cracked the simple substitution cipher. The names revealed were not fellow astronomers or academic colleagues. Instead, they belonged to individuals with connections to defense contracting, military intelligence, and private technology firms. One name stood out immediately: Thomas Richardson, a successful entrepreneur who had built a fortune in the 1980s providing specialized communication equipment to military and intelligence agencies. Richardson's company, Apex Communication Systems, had been one of the primary contractors involved in Project Moonbeam before its cancellation. Phone records subpoenaed from Christopher's home, and office lines showed multiple calls to a number registered to a business consulting firm in Los Angeles. Further investigation revealed this firm served as a front for various corporate intelligence operations. The last call from Christopher's home phone to this number occurred 2 days before his disappearance. Detective Miller and her team interviewed Robert Chen again, this time pressing him about any unusual visitors to the observatory or irregular access to the facility's systems. Chen initially maintained that nothing out of the ordinary had occurred, but under sustained questioning, He admitted that the observatory's security logs showed several instances of after-hours access using an administrative override code. These accesses occurred on nights when no official observations were scheduled. The security footage from those dates had been routinely recorded over, following the observatory's standard 30-day retention policy. However, the technical staff confirmed that someone with the override code could access the facility without leaving a record in the standard visitor logs. A disturbing pattern emerged when investigators examined the maintenance records for the observatory's communication equipment. Stephen Parker, a senior technical specialist who handled equipment repairs and system upgrades, had submitted several work orders in the months before Christopher's disappearance. These orders involved modifications to the facility's radio transmission equipment, upgrades that seemed excessive for an astronomical research station. Background checks on Stephen Parker revealed information that should have been disclosed during his initial employment screening. He had served time in federal prison 15 years earlier for his involvement in an industrial espionage case. After his release, he had changed his legal name and successfully obscured his criminal history through careful manipulation of public records. When confronted with this information, observatory administration expressed shock. Stephen had been a model employee for nearly 8 years, with excellent performance reviews and no indication of questionable behavior. But now, his presence at the facility took on a more sinister significance. Investigators obtained a warrant to search Stephen's residence and workspace at the observatory. Among his possessions, they discovered technical manuals related to lunar reflection communication systems, documents that had no legitimate purpose in his role as a maintenance technician. More concerning were the detailed notes about Christopher's observation schedule, including specific times when the astronomer would be working alone. Amanda Hayes provided additional context when she remembered an incident from 2 months before Christopher's disappearance. He had arrived home visibly shaken after an encounter in the observatory parking lot. A man had approached him, asking pointed questions about his research and suggesting that certain lines of inquiry might be dangerous to pursue. Christopher had dismissed the incident at the time as probably just an eccentric conspiracy theorist, but now it seemed far more ominous. The investigation expanded to include Thomas Richardson's business activities. Corporate records showed that Apex Communication Systems had continued to operate under various subsidiary names long after Project Moonbeam's cancellation. Some of these subsidiaries had contracts with foreign governments and private entities in countries with questionable human rights records. Financial forensics uncovered wire transfers from an offshore account linked to Richardson's business network to the consulting firm that had received calls from Christopher's phone. The amounts were substantial, suggesting payments for specialized services rather than routine business transactions. As the second month of investigation approached, Detective Miller felt certain they were dealing with something far more complex than a simple missing person case. Christopher Hayes had stumbled onto information that threatened powerful interests willing to go to extraordinary lengths to protect their secrets. The discovery that would confirm these suspicions came during a routine forensic examination of the observatory's main telescope. Technicians conducting a detailed inspection found microscopic blood spatter on the telescope's mounting mechanism, barely visible to the naked eye but unmistakable under forensic lighting. DNA analysis would take weeks to complete, but the presence of blood evidence transformed the investigation from a missing person case into a potential homicide. The question now was not simply where Christopher Hayes had gone, but what had happened to him in those final hours at the observatory. And more troubling still, how many people had been involved in ensuring that whatever he had discovered would never come to light. June 1991. The investigation had reached a critical juncture. The blood evidence found at the observatory confirmed that something violent had occurred, transforming the case from a puzzling disappearance into a likely homicide. Detective Sarah Miller now had the resources and authority to pursue leads that extended far beyond the local jurisdiction. The DNA analysis returned with a match to Christopher Hayes, confirming the blood belonged to the missing astronomer. The amount discovered suggested an injury had occurred, though not necessarily a fatal one at that location. This revelation intensified the search efforts and elevated the urgency of tracking down every individual connected to the case. The investigation into Project Moonbeam became paramount. Detective Miller contacted retired military personnel and former government scientists who had worked on the classified program during the 1970s. Most were reluctant to discuss the project, citing security clearances and non-disclosure agreements that remained in effect despite the passage of decades. However, one former engineer proved willing to cooperate. Daniel Morrison had worked for the Department of Defense as a communications specialist during Project Moonbeam's operational phase. Now, 72 years old and living in retirement in Arizona, Morrison agreed to meet with investigators after being assured his cooperation would not violate his security obligations. Morrison explained that Project Moonbeam had been far more sophisticated than publicly acknowledged. The technology allowed for virtually undetectable communication across global distances, using the lunar surface as a natural reflector for encrypted transmissions. The system had potential applications for covert intelligence operations, providing a communication method that could not be intercepted or traced using conventional surveillance technology. The project had been officially discontinued in 1978, Morrison confirmed, but he harbored suspicions that the technology had continued in use through private channels. The equipment and technical specifications had never been fully destroyed or declassified, leaving open the possibility that individuals with the right knowledge and resources could replicate the system for unauthorized purposes. Morrison revealed a crucial detail. Christopher Hayes had contacted him approximately 4 months before his disappearance. The astronomer had asked specific technical questions about lunar reflection coefficients and signal degradation patterns. Christopher had been trying to determine whether the technology could still be operational, and if so, whether its usage would leave detectable traces in astronomical data. This information reframed Christopher's research in a new light. He had not simply been studying historical lunar observations out of academic curiosity. He had been actively searching for evidence that someone was using obsolete military technology for contemporary communication purposes, potentially for illegal activities. Investigators obtained additional warrants to examine Thomas Richardson's business records more thoroughly. What they discovered was a complex web of shell corporations, offshore accounts, and subsidiary companies that obscured the true nature of Richardson's operations. Several of these entities had purchased surplus military communication equipment at government auctions throughout the 1980s, equipment that included components originally designed for Project Moonbeam. Financial analysts working with the investigation traced payments flowing between Richardson's companies and various international clients. Some of these clients operated in countries under sanctions or export restrictions, suggesting that Richardson may have been facilitating illegal technology transfers or providing covert communication services to entities that could not access conventional systems. The connection between Christopher's research and Richardson's business interests became increasingly clear. If the astronomer had discovered evidence of unauthorized use of lunar reflection technology, he would have possessed information that could expose Richardson's entire operation to criminal prosecution and international sanctions violations. Stephen Parker, the observatory technician with the concealed criminal history, emerged as a likely intermediary. His technical expertise would have made him valuable to anyone seeking to use the observatory's equipment for purposes beyond legitimate astronomy. His modification work orders now appeared to be efforts to adapt the facility's systems for covert communication transmission. When investigators attempted to locate Stephen Parker for further questioning, they discovered he had not reported to work since 3 days after Christopher's disappearance. His apartment had been abandoned, with rent unpaid and personal belongings left behind. His bank accounts showed a substantial deposit of $50,000 2 weeks before Christopher vanished, followed by a complete cessation of activity. An arrest warrant was issued for Stephen Parker on charges related to his falsified employment records and potential involvement in Christopher's disappearance. A nationwide alert was distributed to law enforcement agencies, but Parker had effectively vanished, suggesting he had access to resources that enabled him to disappear completely. Amanda Hayes, when informed of these developments, recalled additional details that now carried greater significance. Christopher had mentioned discovering unusual signal patterns in archived data from the 1970s, patterns that seemed to recur in more recent observations. He had theorized that someone might be using the same technology across decades, creating a detectable signature for anyone who knew what to look for. The astronomer had also expressed concern about the potential applications of such technology. In an era of increasing electronic surveillance and signal intelligence, a communication method that left virtually no traceable footprint would be extraordinarily valuable to criminal organizations, espionage networks, or anyone seeking to evade detection. Detective Miller coordinated with federal agencies, including the FBI and the Department of Defense's Security Division. The case now involved potential violations of export control laws, conspiracy charges, and quite possibly murder in the service of protecting an illegal operation. Search efforts in the mountainous terrain around Mount Wilson Observatory were renewed with greater intensity. Specialized search and rescue teams deployed ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs to areas identified as potential disposal sites. The rugged landscape and dense vegetation made the search extraordinarily difficult, with countless locations where remains could be concealed. A break came when forensic accountants discovered that Thomas Richardson's companies had purchased property in the San Gabriel Mountains, ostensibly for communication equipment testing. The parcels were remote and had minimal development, located in areas rarely accessed by hikers or forestry services. As investigators prepared to search these properties, they uncovered one more disturbing detail. Satellite imagery from April 1991 showed vehicle activity at one of these remote sites during the early morning hours of April 16th, just hours after Christopher Hayes had last been seen at the observatory. The pieces were falling into place, painting a picture of conspiracy, greed, and violence. But the most crucial question remained unanswered. Where was Christopher Hayes, and what had been done to silence the astronomer who had discovered too much? The answer lay buried in the mountains, waiting to be unearthed after more than 3 decades of concealment. September 1991. 5 months had passed since Christopher Hayes vanished from Mount Wilson Observatory. The investigation had evolved from a local missing person case into a complex federal matter involving multiple agencies and crossing international boundaries. Detective Sarah Miller coordinated with FBI agents specializing in technology crimes and organized criminal activity. The evidence gathered painted an increasingly disturbing picture of corruption, illegal operations, and calculated violence designed to protect secrets worth millions of dollars. The remote properties owned by Thomas Richardson's subsidiary companies became the focus of intensive investigation. Legal challenges delayed immediate searches as Richardson's attorneys fought the warrants through every available channel. The prolonged legal battle suggested that whatever might be found on those properties was worth protecting at considerable expense. While waiting for court approval, investigators pursued other avenues. Phone records analysis revealed a pattern of communication between Richardson's personal mobile phone and a number registered to Stephen Parker during the weeks before Christopher's disappearance. The calls increased in frequency as April approached, with several occurring in the 24 hours before the astronomer vanished. More troubling were calls from Richardson's phone to international numbers in countries known for lax banking regulations and minimal cooperation with United States law enforcement. Financial investigators identified these numbers as belonging to brokers who specialized in facilitating discrete financial transactions and arranging disappearances for individuals seeking to evade authorities. The $50,000 deposit into Stephen Parker's account was traced back through multiple intermediary transfers to an offshore entity controlled by Richardson's business network. This direct financial connection established a clear relationship between the two men during the critical time period, contradicting Richardson's claims that he had no knowledge of Parker or his activities. Amanda Hayes continued to cooperate fully with investigators, providing access to Christopher's personal files and research materials stored at their home. Among these documents, investigators found correspondence between Christopher and several former Project Moonbeam personnel, including Daniel Morrison. The letters revealed that Christopher had been building a comprehensive case documenting the unauthorized use of classified technology. Christopher had intended to present his findings to the appropriate federal authorities, but he wanted to ensure his evidence was irrefutable before making formal allegations. His meticulous nature, which made him an excellent scientist, may have inadvertently given those he was investigating time to become aware of his activities and take preemptive action. The observatory's director, Robert Chen, came under renewed scrutiny when investigators discovered he had received consultant payments from one of Richardson's subsidiary companies 3 years prior. Chen insisted the payments were for legitimate technical advice regarding astronomical equipment procurement, but the timing and amounts raised questions about potential conflicts of interest. Under pressure, Chen revealed additional information about irregularities at the observatory. He had noticed unauthorized modifications to communication equipment, but had attributed them to Stephen Parker's initiative in upgrading systems. Chen admitted he had not questioned these modifications closely because the equipment continued to function properly for astronomical purposes. The implications were clear. The observatory had been compromised, its facilities used for purposes beyond scientific research. Stephen Parker had operated with relative freedom, making changes that would allow the transmission of covert signals under the cover of legitimate astronomical operations. Forensic computer experts examined the observatory's data systems, recovering deleted files and analyzing system logs for evidence of unauthorized activity. They discovered that during the months before Christopher's disappearance, significant amounts of data had been transmitted from the facility during overnight hours. The transmissions used frequencies and protocols inconsistent with standard astronomical data sharing. These transmissions had been carefully disguised within normal operational traffic, but Christopher's detailed observations and systematic record-keeping had allowed him to identify the anomalies. His research notes included calculations demonstrating that the signal patterns matched the technical specifications of Project Moonbeam's lunar reflection system. The federal warrant to search Richardson's mountain properties was finally approved in late September. Search teams including FBI agents, forensic specialists, and local law enforcement converged on 3 separate locations spread across the remote sections of the San Gabriel Mountains. The first property appeared to be an abandoned equipment testing facility with deteriorating structures and overgrown access roads. However, ground-penetrating radar detected anomalies beneath what appeared to be a concrete equipment pad. Excavation revealed buried electronic equipment consistent with communication transmission systems, equipment that matched the technical specifications of Project Moonbeam components. The second property yielded evidence of recent activity despite its apparent abandonment. Tire tracks indicated vehicles had accessed the site within the past year. Inside a locked maintenance building, investigators found documentation related to signal transmission schedules, encryption protocols, and client communications. The documents confirmed that Richardson had been operating an illegal communication service for clients seeking untraceable international communications. The third property, located in a particularly isolated ravine accessible only by a poorly maintained service road, would prove to be the most significant discovery. The site featured a small concrete structure partially concealed by natural vegetation and deliberate camouflage. The building's door bore evidence of forced entry from some time ago, but the lock had been replaced and the structure secured. Inside this building, forensic teams made a discovery that transformed the investigation once again. Personal items belonging to Christopher Hayes were found in a storage locker. His wallet, his wedding ring, his observatory identification badge, and his personal notebook containing research observations from the night he disappeared. More critically, forensic examination of the structure revealed biological evidence indicating someone had been injured inside the building. Luminol testing showed traces of cleaned blood on the concrete floor and walls, patterns consistent with an attempt to sanitize the scene. Despite the cleaning efforts, sufficient material remained for DNA analysis. The location and condition of Christopher's belongings suggested this site had been used as a meeting point, possibly the location referenced in his final observatory log entry. The evidence indicated violence had occurred here, violence that someone had worked to conceal but had not entirely eliminated. Soil samples from the surrounding area were collected for analysis. Cadaver dogs were brought to the site, and their behavior indicated the presence of human remains somewhere in the vicinity. The teams began a systematic search of the ravine, using ground-penetrating radar and carefully excavating areas identified as suspicious. As September drew to a close, investigators prepared for what they increasingly believed would be the recovery of Christopher Hayes's remains. The evidence suggested he had been lured to this remote location, attacked, and his body concealed in a manner designed to prevent discovery. Thomas Richardson was taken into custody on charges related to illegal operation of communication systems, export control violations, and conspiracy. His attorneys immediately moved to arrange bail, but prosecutors argued successfully that Richardson posed a flight risk given his international connections and the severity of the charges. The search for Stephen Parker intensified, with federal resources now dedicated to locating the fugitive technician. His photograph and information were distributed to international law enforcement agencies through Interpol, based on intelligence suggesting he may have fled the country. As investigators continued their methodical search of the mountain property, they knew they were close to answers that had eluded them for months. The question was no longer whether Christopher Hayes had been murdered, but rather the exact circumstances of his death and the location of his remains. What they would discover in the coming days would confirm their darkest suspicions and reveal the full extent of the conspiracy that had cost a dedicated scientist his life. October 1991. The remote ravine in the San Gabriel Mountains had become the center of an intensive forensic investigation. What began as a missing person case had transformed into a complex conspiracy involving illegal technology, international espionage, and murder. The search teams worked methodically through the rugged terrain surrounding the concrete structure where Christopher Hayes's personal belongings had been discovered. Ground-penetrating radar identified several areas of disturbed soil, locations where the earth had been excavated and refilled in patterns inconsistent with natural erosion or animal activity. On October 12th, investigators made the discovery that had seemed inevitable since the blood evidence first emerged at Mount Wilson Observatory. Approximately 200 yards from the concrete building, concealed beneath rocks and carefully placed vegetation, forensic teams uncovered human remains. The location had been chosen with deliberate calculation. The ravine's steep walls and dense undergrowth made casual discovery nearly impossible. Seasonal water flow through the area would have accelerated decomposition and dispersed evidence. Only systematic searching with specialized equipment could have located the burial site. Preliminary examination by forensic pathologists confirmed the remains were consistent with Christopher Hayes's physical characteristics. Dental records would provide definitive identification, but investigators had little doubt they had found the missing astronomer. The condition of the remains indicated they had been concealed since approximately the time of Christopher's disappearance in April. While forensic work continued at the mountain site, investigators focused on building a comprehensive case against those responsible. The evidence collected over the previous months formed a disturbing narrative of greed, technology theft, and calculated violence. Stephen Parker remained at large, but investigators had developed a detailed understanding of his role in the conspiracy. Financial records showed he had been receiving regular payments from Richardson's network for nearly 2 years before Christopher's disappearance. These payments corresponded with the timeline of unauthorized modifications to the observatory's communication equipment. Parker's technical expertise had been essential to Richardson's operation. The observatory's legitimate astronomical equipment provided perfect cover for covert communication transmissions. By carefully integrating unauthorized systems with the facility's existing infrastructure, Parker had created a transmission capability that could operate undetected within the normal pattern of scientific activity. Christopher Hayes's methodical observation protocols had been his strength as a scientist, but ultimately led to his discovery of the illegal operation. His detailed logging of all astronomical observations included noting anomalies in signal patterns and equipment behavior. Over months of accumulated data, Christopher had recognized patterns that should not exist in purely astronomical research. The recovered documents from Richardson's mountain properties revealed the scope of his illegal communications service. Client lists included individuals and organizations from multiple countries, some with known connections to criminal enterprises and hostile intelligence services. The service had generated millions of dollars in revenue by providing untraceable communication channels to those willing to pay premium rates for absolute security. Federal prosecutors assembled charges against Thomas Richardson that included conspiracy to commit murder, illegal operation of communication systems, violations of export control laws, money laundering, and obstruction of justice. The evidence was substantial, drawn from financial records, technical documentation, witness testimony, and forensic analysis. Richardson's defense attorneys attempted to negotiate a plea agreement, but prosecutors refused to reduce the murder conspiracy charge. The evidence indicated Richardson had direct knowledge of plans to silence Christopher Hayes and had provided financial resources to facilitate the crime. Under mounting pressure and facing overwhelming evidence, Stephen Parker's role in the conspiracy became the focus of intense investigative effort. Prosecutors believed Parker had been the individual who actually carried out the attack on Christopher, acting on Richardson's orders and with the promise of substantial payment. International cooperation eventually led to Stephen Parker's location. He had fled to Central America, living under an assumed identity in a coastal town with minimal law enforcement infrastructure. Federal agents worked with local authorities to arrange his arrest and extradition back to the United States. Parker's capture in late October provided investigators with the opportunity to complete their understanding of the crime. Faced with extensive evidence and the possibility of life imprisonment, Parker's attorneys advised cooperation with authorities. Through his legal representatives, Parker provided a detailed account of the events leading to Christopher Hayes' death. According to Parker's statement, Richardson had become aware of Christopher's investigation through monitoring of the astronomer's communications and research requests. As Christopher's inquiries became more specific and his evidence more substantial, Richardson determined that the astronomer posed an unacceptable threat to the entire illegal operation. Richardson had instructed Parker to arrange a meeting with Christopher under the pretense of providing insider information about Project Moonbeam's historical operations. The meeting location was the remote mountain property, chosen for its isolation and Richardson's control of the site. Christopher had been led to believe he would receive documentation that would conclusively prove his theories about the unauthorized use of lunar reflection technology. Instead, he walked into a confrontation that turned violent when he realized he had been deceived. Parker's account indicated that the attack had not been originally planned as murder, but rather as intimidation. However, when Christopher fought back and threatened to report everything to federal authorities regardless of personal consequences, the situation escalated fatally. The astronomer's body had been concealed at the site, with his personal belongings initially kept as potential leverage or evidence to be disposed of later. Parker had returned to the observatory briefly to remove any evidence of Christopher's research that might point toward the illegal communication operation, but he had missed some documents due to Christopher's careful concealment of backup materials. The forensic evidence corroborated key elements of Parker's account. The pattern of biological evidence at the concrete structure was consistent with a physical confrontation. The location and condition of Christopher's remains matched the timeline and method of concealment described. Amanda Hayes was informed of the discovery and the progress of the investigation. After months of uncertainty, she finally had answers about her husband's fate, though the truth brought no comfort. Christopher had died because his scientific integrity and curiosity had led him to uncover criminal activity that powerful interests wanted to remain hidden. The case had revealed systemic failures that had allowed the conspiracy to operate undetected. Background check procedures at the observatory had failed to identify Stephen Parker's criminal history. Security protocols had been insufficient to detect unauthorized equipment modifications. And the compartmentalized nature of classified programs had made it difficult for Christopher to verify his suspicions through official channels. As November approached, prosecutors prepared for trial, while investigators compiled the final elements of their case. The evidence was overwhelming, the conspiracy fully documented, and the perpetrators in custody. But even as justice moved forward through the legal system, questions remained about the full extent of Richardson's illegal operation and whether other individuals had been harmed or threatened in service of protecting the lucrative communication network. The answer to those questions would emerge during the trial, revealing that Christopher Hayes had not been the first person to discover Richardson's operation, only the one whose death had finally brought the entire conspiracy into the light. March 2023. 32 years after Christopher Hayes vanished from Mount Wilson Observatory, advances in forensic technology and renewed investigation efforts brought final closure to a case that had never been fully resolved. The original investigation in 1991 had resulted in convictions, but questions had lingered. Stephen Parker had pleaded guilty to manslaughter and conspiracy charges in 1992, receiving a sentence of 25 years in federal prison. Thomas Richardson had been convicted on multiple charges, including conspiracy to commit murder, receiving a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. However, Christopher Hayes's remains had never been positively identified through DNA analysis in the original investigation. The forensic technology available in 1991 had been limited, and the condition of the remains had made traditional identification methods challenging. The case had been closed based on circumstantial evidence, dental records analysis, and the confessions provided by the perpetrators. Amanda Hayes, now 65 years old, had spent 3 decades seeking definitive confirmation of her husband's fate. She had maintained contact with law enforcement agencies, providing DNA samples and requesting that advances in forensic science be applied to the case whenever possible. The breakthrough came when cold case investigators in Los Angeles County began systematically reviewing unsolved cases using modern DNA analysis techniques. The remains recovered from the mountain site in 1991 had been preserved in evidence storage, and new extraction methods made it possible to obtain usable genetic material despite the degradation caused by time and environmental exposure. In January 2023, forensic geneticists successfully extracted sufficient DNA from bone samples to create a comprehensive genetic profile. Comparison with Amanda Hayes's DNA and samples from Christopher's surviving relatives provided definitive confirmation that the remains were indeed those of the missing astronomer. This confirmation prompted a comprehensive review of the entire case file. Investigators discovered that the original investigation, despite resulting in convictions, had not fully explored certain aspects of the conspiracy. Specifically, questions remained about whether other individuals had been involved in the illegal communication operation or the cover-up of Christopher's murder. Digital forensics experts applied modern analysis techniques to computer equipment and data storage media seized during the original investigation. Equipment that had seemed unrecoverable in 1991 yielded substantial information when examined with contemporary technology. These recovered files revealed that Richardson's operation had been even more extensive than originally understood. The illegal communication network had operated for nearly a decade before Christopher Hayes discovered it, serving clients across multiple continents. Financial records showed the operation had generated over $15 million in revenue during its operational lifetime. More troubling were communications indicating that Christopher had not been the only person who had become aware of the illegal operation. 2 other individuals, including a telecommunications engineer and a government auditor, had apparently discovered evidence of the unauthorized system in the years before Christopher's investigation. Both of these individuals had died in what were officially ruled as accidents. The telecommunications engineer had perished in a car crash in 1987, while the government auditor had died in a hiking accident in 1989. The recovered communications suggested these deaths may not have been accidental but rather additional murders designed to protect Richardson's operation. Law enforcement agencies reopened investigations into both deaths. Modern accident reconstruction techniques and forensic analysis of available evidence provided new perspectives on circumstances that had seemed straightforward at the time. While definitive proof of foul play remained elusive due to the passage of time, investigators developed substantial circumstantial evidence suggesting both deaths warranted classification as suspicious. Stephen Parker, who had been released from federal prison in 2017 after serving his full sentence, was located living under supervised release conditions in the Midwest. Now 73 years old, Parker was questioned again about the full extent of his activities and knowledge of other potential crimes. Parker maintained that he had only been directly involved in the attack on Christopher Hayes and knew nothing about other suspicious deaths. However, his credibility remained questionable given his history of deception and self-preservation. Investigators believed he possessed information he continued to withhold, but without new evidence or leverage, they could not compel additional cooperation. Thomas Richardson remained incarcerated in federal prison, where he had spent the past 3 decades. At 81 years old and in declining health, Richardson had consistently refused to discuss the case beyond his original statements. His continued silence suggested either loyalty to potential co-conspirators or concern about additional legal jeopardy for crimes that remained uncharged. The modern investigation confirmed what many had suspected. Christopher Hayes had paid the ultimate price for his scientific integrity and commitment to truth. His meticulous research and unwillingness to ignore evidence of wrongdoing had led him into conflict with individuals who valued profit over human life. Amanda Hayes, informed of the definitive identification and the renewed investigation findings, finally received the closure she had sought for 3 decades. Christopher's remains were released to the family, and a memorial service was held in April 2023, 32 years to the month after his disappearance. The service attracted attention from the scientific community, law enforcement personnel who had worked on the case, and members of the public who had followed the investigation over the years. Christopher was remembered not only as a victim, but as a scientist whose dedication to truth had exposed criminal activity that might otherwise have continued undetected for years longer. The case prompted reviews of security protocols at scientific research facilities across the country. The ability of criminal actors to compromise legitimate research institutions for illegal purposes had been dramatically demonstrated, leading to enhanced background check procedures and security monitoring systems. Mount Wilson Observatory, where Christopher had made his final observations and discovered the evidence that would cost him his life, established a memorial in his honor. The Christopher Hayes Memorial Fund was created to support young astronomers pursuing research careers and to promote scientific integrity in the face of external pressures. The legal consequences for those responsible extended beyond the original convictions. Civil litigation brought by the Hayes family against Richardson's remaining assets resulted in substantial financial judgments, though much of Richardson's wealth had been seized or dissipated during the criminal proceedings. Federal agencies conducted comprehensive reviews of classified technology security, examining how obsolete military communication systems had been diverted to criminal use. New protocols were established for tracking and destroying sensitive equipment to prevent future unauthorized applications. The investigation's resolution in 2023 represented both closure and vindication for Christopher Hayes. The conspiracy that had taken his life had been fully exposed, the perpetrators held accountable, and his scientific work validated. The lunar reflection patterns he had identified as evidence of illegal activity were confirmed through modern analysis, proving that his conclusions had been correct. Amanda Hayes, reflecting on the decades of uncertainty and the final confirmation, expressed gratitude that truth had ultimately prevailed despite the long delay. Her husband's legacy had been preserved not as a man who had mysteriously vanished, but as a scientist who had maintained his integrity even when doing so placed him in mortal danger. The case of Christopher Hayes served as a reminder that justice, while sometimes delayed, could still be achieved through persistent investigation, advances in forensic science, and the dedication of individuals committed to uncovering truth. After 32 years, the astronomer who had studied the paths of light reflecting from the lunar surface had finally been brought home, his story told, and his memory honored. The night sky above Mount Wilson Observatory continued its eternal patterns, indifferent to the human dramas played out beneath its vastness. But for those who had known Christopher Hayes and fought to reveal the truth of his fate, the stars would forever carry a different meaning, a reminder that some lights, once extinguished, leave echoes that persist across decades until justice finally illuminates the darkness.